The first outstanding organ, it isn't by any means the first organ we built in a theater, was the one that we sold to the Liberty Theater in Seattle. We shipped that in late 1914. That was a tremendous success. The theater was built especially as a motion picture theater. They had no provision for an orchestra. They depended entirely on our organ for music, and the theater was quite original. See, up to that time, nearly all of the theaters were remodeled theaters. And they had one feature that at that time was unusual, was a ramp to go up to the balcony instead of having stairs. Well, the theater was such a tremendous success at the start, I'm not exaggerating in telling you this, that for 3 weeks the Seattle police had to take care of the crowds that stood for 3 blocks waiting their turn to get into the Liberty Theater. Well, that, of course, was a great help to us, the success of that theater. And the business grew especially on the Pacific Coast. I recall that there was a theater, so I was told, in San Francisco. It was way out on Market Street, not downtown, that had closed 23 times. Maybe they exaggerated when they told me. We put an organ in there and it was a success. It wasn't a large model. And at that time, Sid Grauman, who had a theater in San Francisco on Market Street, he became interested in our organ. And a little later on, he arranged to install an organ in his new theater in Los Angeles called the $1 Million Theater on Broadway. And that was a very successful installation. To my mind, Sid Grauman was perhaps the greatest moving picture showman that we have ever had. He was a most unusual character. I could tell you stories by the hour of many things he did that were very unusual. He was very absent-minded, but he was very gifted. When he put on a show at the $1 Million Theater, he had his usherettes, not men ushers, usherettes in the costume that suited the picture. If it was Oriental, they had an Oriental costume. If it was something else, why, they wore that costume. The shows usually were on for more than 1 week. They were usually on for 6 weeks or so. And he was very enthusiastic about our organ, and he did so much to sell the idea of our organ to other moving picture people. For instance, to Balaban and Katz. Sam Katz came out there to Los Angeles. Sid Grauman made it a special chore for him to sell Sam Katz. The same thing with Mr. Zucker, who is the father of the Paramount organization. And when Mr. Zucker came out, he gave him a special demonstration after the show was over, and our representative out there, who was also a director of our company, Buzz Lyons, met Mr. Zucker and started to talk to him about organs for all their theaters, because they had many throughout the United States. Mr. Zucker said, "I'm too busy to talk to you now, but I'm leaving tomorrow evening on the train for San Francisco. I have a drawing room, and if you'll be on that train, we'll talk about it." So it was arranged that the board of directors of the Wurlitzer Company, the board of directors of the Paramount organization were to meet and discuss the buying of Wurlitzer organs for all of their theaters. Well, 3 of us went down. I went down. Mr. Lyons was there from the coast, and Mr. Ryan, who was also a member of the board, was present. But we didn't meet with their board. We met with Mr. Connick, who was running the Paramount organization for the banks because they had gotten involved financially. Mr. Connick knew a good deal about church organs. His thought was that how many stops did we have in this model, how many in that? And we changed the subject always, because that was one thing that we didn't want to discuss, because with the Hope Jones system, the unit system, We didn't use as many stops as church organs did, but we got the results. Well, to make the story short, Mr. Koenig said it appears as if none of us know too much about the organs. But we did get the orders, and we did install Wurlitzer organs in all the Paramount theaters. And the same way with Balaban and Katz in Chicago. And as you know, Mr. Balaban is today president of the Paramount organization. And we had the business of practically all the chains, the Keith, Circuit, and Lowe's, really all of them. Our organs cost more than those of any other make, and there was a reason for it. The materials and the design were expensive, and the workmanship that went into them. We used only the very finest grade of sugar pine, first and second, and solid mahogany or solid cherry, because they didn't chip when you bored into them. And of course, Hope Jones had laid the foundation for this quality, which we believed in and followed. In 1918, we installed the organ in the Denver City Auditorium. That was the largest organ that we ever built. I remember being out there when we were trying to get the contract, and Madame Schumann-Heink sang in the auditorium. Well, she was returning to Chicago the next day, but at noon there was a meeting of the Rotary Club, and I met Schumann-Heink. She had a big sign across her chest saying "Baby Ernestine." So when I met her in the sleeping car that night, in those days it took much longer to go to Chicago than it does nowadays. The trains are faster. I said, "Good evening, Ernestine." She just stepped back quite shocked. She said, I don't remember your first name." I told her who I was, and she knew our family in Cincinnati. She had sung there many times. And she had a drawing room. She also had her accompanist, a woman who was with her in another compartment. Well, the next morning, when I got up earlier than she did, when her drawing room was being made up, I said, "Don't you want to sit in my seat here? I only had a berth. I didn't have a drawing room." And so she joined me. Well, she spent the whole morning, and she told me the history of her life, which was most interesting. She was a wonderful woman. She told me about each of her husbands. There were 4 of them. What their characteristics were, and about her present husband that she had. And she had a large number of children. And this was in February 1917. It was just at the time when von Bernstorff had been given his walking papers by Washington, because I think the Lusitania had been torpedoed. And we were about to break off relations with Germany. And she said to me, "You know, my heart bleeds, because I have sons that are in the German army. I have sons that are in the American army." She said, "They'll be fighting each other." She at that time had a home in San Diego, California. And so I met the one son that was with her in Denver. And she was a very warm-hearted individual. When she got on the stage, why, the audience was just with her. They knew that they were part of her. And she had that ability. She was idolized in Denver. She was very much loved in Denver, and a very good friend of the mayor. And the mayor was the one that would decide the question of the organ. Well, we got the order for the organ. And we had a lot of problems. The organ had 50-inch wind pressure. And to get 50 inches of wind pressure, the wind is heated an awful lot through the blower and the friction. And we couldn't keep the organ in tune. The temperature up in the organ chambers was 120 degrees. And Louis Lockwood, who was superintendent of the plant, spent, I believe, almost a year out there. We had the blower companies come out to help us. They couldn't do anything. He finally solved the problem in a very simple way. There was an immense volume of air, of course, blown through these blowers. He took a garden hose, turned the water on, and put it in the blower. That cooled the air immediately. The evaporation of the water brought the temperature down. We had no trouble after that. But there were many things like that we'd run into. We had many problems with architects. They didn't realize the necessity of giving us the right location for our organ so that the tone could come out. All they thought of was the design of the theater and the beauty of it, and we'd have to put up quite a fight. And we'd appeal to the buyer and say, now, do you want to buy an organ from us and pay that much money and then get only 25 or 50% results? That's what's going to happen if you don't let us have proper openings to the tone that comes out of the chamber. Well, we fortunately won out in, I think, almost all cases. One of our early problems was finding men to play our organ. You see, church organists didn't know how to play a theater organ and follow the music. You see, in the early days, the films were silent, and they had to depend on the music to interpret the picture. So we tried to train people to play our organs. And gradually, of course, the famous names developed that really did interpret what could be done with the Wurlitzer organ, as well as the other makes of organs. I don't wish to slight the competition. Names that I know most of you know. Jesse Crawford is, I think, the best known of all of them. He played here in Buffalo for Mike Shea at Shea's Buffalo Theater. Albert Hay Malott had played for Mike Shea at Shea's Hippodrome. He is the composer of The Lord's Prayer. And there were many others. Henry Murtaugh was the man that opened the Liberty Theater in Seattle. But he was followed by a very brilliant man, Ollie G. Wallace. I might tell you a little more going back of some of the failures. We put an organ in the new Pitt Theater in Pittsburgh. It was a regular stage show. Unfortunately, the Ohio River got higher than it should and entered the theater, and the organ was drowned. So that ended rather unfortunately, but that was one of the many experiences that we had and disappointments.